if you use it to actually drink a cup of tea. Not that they let me drink cups of tea from them. There are also interior parts that are named. I'm not sure which of these diagrams is better for that. The mouth, of course. In the bottom of a good tea bowl, there's a little extra space for tea, where you put the powdered tea in before you put the water in and whip it out. That's called the chadomari. Chadomari, the place for the tea. Other than that, there aren't that many rules. In fact, there are so many different. In fact, there are many, many different shapes that tea bowls can take. The most standard are the Ito, kind of a bell shape, inverted bell shape, if you will. But there are also shapes that are like shoes that are mushed out of round, and very wide variety of shapes. Wintry shapes that are tall and hold the heat in. Summer shapes that are open and flat and let the heat from the tea flow out. So, what about the history of tea bowls? Well, we don't know what people were drinking tea from in the very early years in China. There's not a lot of records. There are bowls that are archaeologically recovered that might have been used for tea, but who knows for sure. Until the time of the 8th century, when, in the Tang Dynasty, a famous tea drinker and poet sat down and wrote a book that's come to be known as the Classic of Tea, or the Chajing. In Japanese, that's Chakyo, and that kyo is literally the word that's used for a Buddhist sutra or sacred text. This is the earliest record that we have of specific elements of tea, and in it, Lu Yu talks about a few very specific types of tea bowls. He doesn't give us a lot of details, but he does give us some. He certainly says that the tea bowls made in the town of Yue are the best. They're better than the things from Ding, they're better than the things from Wu, they're better than the things from Shao, they're better than the things from Hong, they're better than the things from Xing. And he goes into a little bit of why. So where are these 7 potteries that he mentions? Well, Yue is very famous. It's named for a city that's named for a county that's named for what was at one time an independent kingdom in southeast China. There where the circle is stopping. That turns out to be an essential place for pottery manufacture, and there's several hundred years of history in Yuezhou, making what we come to know as Yue ware, Yue Yao. It's close by to Longchan, where the most famous celadons are going to be made hundreds of years later than Lu Yu's time. It's close, it's not terribly far from Jingdezhen, where Chinese porcelain becomes the primary product. Dingzhou is farther west. Wuzhou is right next door, very close to Yuezhou. One problem is that, with the exception of Yue and Xing, I think all of these towns have different names today than they had in the Tang Dynasty. So you have to look through a lot of historical books to really figure it out. Fortunately, Chinese scholars have done that for us, so we don't have to do it ourselves. There's also a second town named Yue in Hunan that produces a related kind of pottery that comes to be known as Northern Celadon, as opposed to the Southern Celadon of the other Yuezhou and Wu. Shou in Anhui and Hongzhou in Jiangxi. And finally, he mentions Xingware from up north in Hebei. So what do these things look like? Well, it's not easy to relate them to things that survive in the modern day. Some cases we're lucky. Yue, this is a piece that we know was made in Yue. It was actually archaeologically recovered from a Yue kiln site. And it gives us a very good sense of what we conceptualize as Yue ware. It has this olive green glaze. Sometimes it's a bluer glaze, sometimes it's a greener glaze, sometimes it's a grayer glaze. But it's got a little bit of gloss to it, but not too much. And it varies a lot over time. The earlier pieces, which go back 300 years before the Tang Dynasty, are quite brown in color. Partly because we can get technical and say, well, that's because they hadn't figured out how to stop the oxygen from getting into the kiln and turning the iron red instead of black. Dingware is almost white, kind of ivory white color. It's made from the same kind of porcelain, kind of clay that we make porcelain from, but it's not fired up quite to porcelain temperatures. And in order to make it a little more solid, after making the pot, they dip it in slip that is pure white, and then coat it with a clear glaze to fire it. Shou, where I had a lot of trouble finding a tea bowl from Shou. It turns out that the Anhui Provincial Museum has one. And so it's a little hard to find. It's a yellower color, but similar to. Wu, just south of Yue, produced this one, we think. This is from the northern site in the other Yue. Hongware is kind of grayish green. And finally, Xingware. When I teach my survey of East Asian ceramics, I actually teach Xingware as part of the development of porcelain rather than stoneware. It's right on the edge between the two. So Lu Yu goes on to tell you why the tea bowls of Yue are the best in making a lot of metaphors, a lot of comparisons. Ultimately comparing Xing and Yueware and saying that the tea just doesn't look as good in white as it does in green. And then he goes on to quote another Tang poet who also liked Yue Wei. And there's a lot of text there, but basically his point is that Yue Wei is the best. But I want to back up, I can't do it. So fast forward a couple hundred years into the Song dynasty. This is the time when tea was transmitted to Japan. Actually, tea had been transmitted to Japan long before that, in Lu Yu's time, in fact, but it didn't catch on. By the 12th century, however, tea was an important part of Zen practice in Japan. It was an important part of Zen practice, what becomes Zen practice, Chan practice in China, and had been picked up by Japanese priests visiting China and brought back to Japan. So it's the bowls that were made in the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th centuries that became the precious possessions of warlords and tea masters alike. And sometimes the warlord became a tea aficionado himself. So we see not only things from the north, that northern style of Celadon, but other things from the most up-to-date kiln in the Yue region, in Zhejiang. Longchuan Celadon, which is a little bit bluer in tone, a little bit softer in feeling. It actually has crystalline structure within the glaze that makes it look very soft. So there again, you have a contrast built into the bowl, that it looks soft even though it's hard as a rock. Subgroups within the Longchuan region, there are kilns that produce very crackled ware, go-ware, guan-ware, and roux-ware. Roux tends to be a little bluer. If you're sitting close enough to the screen, you may be able to see that roux-ware has double crackle. So it has a big network of crackle, and within that, a tiny network of crackle. Of course, my pottery teacher, when I studied in Japan, would tell me that crackle is a mistake. Crackle means that the glaze and the pot don't fit very well. The body of the pot is shrinking less than the glaze does as it cools, so that it actually pulls the glaze apart into sections, and that's where those cracks show up. I've been in, just to show you the nature of tea teachers, my tea teacher, main teacher, pottery teacher in Japan, when he had a one-man exhibition, would always be firing like the night before, or 2 nights before. So he would take his pieces, and as soon as they got cool enough, pack them up, take them to the exhibition hall. And then as we sat there in the exhibition, watching over things, talking to visitors, from time to time there would be a loud ping! And that was the crackle for me. If you were lucky. If you were unlucky, the glaze would actually slide off. Junware is a related kind of pottery. It's a glaze that instead of green coming from very dispersed iron. The blue or the green here comes from manganese, and it's very different. It also usually has some copper. It often has splashes of red copper. At the other end of the scale, the dark side, if you will, is what the Japanese come to call tenmoku. Tenmoku. It's actually named for a mountain range, the Tenmu Mountains, near the town of Jen, where the pottery was fired. The mountains have a name that ties into this pottery very nicely. It literally means the eye of heaven. And you'll see that, maybe you'll see if I can get. The glazes are heavily soaked iron-based glaze, and you'll see a number of tea bowls in the exhibition that are glazed with this Tenmoku glaze. As it cools, the iron forms crystals that form patterns. And early masters thought that some of the patterns looked like rabbit hair, rabbit fur, hare's fur, if you will. Looking down into it, you can see why they think of the eye of heaven. You also get a very good view of the chadamani, the place for the tea in the bottom of the bowl. Sometimes the iron crystals look like spots of oil on water, if you will. And sometimes they form dramatically large crystalline structures that we call yohen, changed in the kiln. A bowl like this would probably have to sit at full glaze maturation temperature for 10 or 12 hours for those crystalline structures to get that big. So it's very hard to reproduce. This one is known as the Inaba because of the family that passed it down through the generations. It's now in a museum in Tokyo. Sometimes they did amazing things. Take a leaf, soak it in just the right chemicals, put it under the glaze, fire the piece, and the glaze, the actual veins of the leaf survive as a pattern. Related, where from not too far away, they would use a paper cutout to make a pattern in the glaze. Of course, the paper fires away, but it means the glaze didn't, one component of the glaze doesn't stick to the rest of the pot. The outside looks like the shell of a turtle, so tortoise shell. Most Tenmoku bowls are quite small. They were highly revered, so much so that when Japan puts its tea practice together, there are special rules for handling a Tenmoku tea bowl that involve putting it on a stand so that it never touches the ground. It's really quite elaborate. You could paint in patterns. You could obviously put anything you like in those silhouettes. Well, that establishes what the peak of the most beautiful tea bowls in Japan were. Those very expensive imports from China. As time went on, not only the Chinese, but their neighbors in Korea began to create celadon ware that was prized in some cases even more highly than the Chinese versions. It could be plain, it could have a pattern incised into it. They actually learned how to inlay white and black slip into the surface of the bowl, so now you've got 3 colors going on. And sometimes under the glaze they paint in copper, which can fire to a brilliant flaming strawberry red. The Koryo dynasty falls in the end of the 14th century. And while their successors continued to make celadon for a while, eventually they developed a softer, often grayer and sometimes yellower kind of pottery. In the 20th century, this came to be known as buncheon ware. We don't know what the Koreans called it at the time. The Japanese named the different types of it, rather than naming the whole complex of materials. Kobiki, a strange name, literally means powder and pulled. What do they mean by pulled powder? Well, it's a reference to the glaze that when you pull the pot out of the liquid glaze and let it dry, those glaze chemicals form a powder. And then when you fire it, of course, they turn into glassy, solid glaze. So that's how it gets that name. Many different shapes. Most kobiki is actually, the pot is formed, then it's dipped in slip, and then it's dipped in glaze. So it has lots of opportunities for crackle to form, lots of opportunities for imperfections. We can sometimes just apply that slip with a brush and leave brush marks or hakeme. Sometimes they went back to the inlay process, but in many cases, instead of carving in line by line, dot by dot, they would use a stamp and repeat tiny patterns over and over again. Then fill those with inlay, white, usually white clay, and coat the whole thing in clear glaze and produce inlaid buncheon ware. That gives an odd name. It's called Mishima-de in Japanese, which makes it sound like it's made in a place called Mishima, 3 islands. But in fact, what was made in Mishima are almanacs, like annual books like the Old Farmer's Almanac or Ben Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac, that gave you notes about auspicious days, when to plant your corn, when the moon was going to change color, etc., etc., etc. Those books were printed in very small characters, lined up in neat rows. So the almanac reminds the viewer of the pottery. And the Mishima Shrine technology is wonderful when it works. The Mishima Shrine was the biggest producer of almanacs. So the pottery gets to be called Koyomi-de, almanac style, and then Mishima-de, even though it doesn't come from Mishima at all. But you can see how those rows of little dots reminded the viewers of almanac pages. Show you the kind of respect some tea bowls get. This is a piece I looked at last fall, and it's actually on display in the Freer Gallery, National Museum of Asian Art, as we speak. When you go to look at it, you see a wooden box, kind of unprepossessing. Doesn't say much on the surface, just there's a tea bowl in here, and the 2 characters Naruto. Well, if you've been to Western Japan, you might know that Naruto is the location of a great whirlpool. That when the tide moves in and out between the inland sea and the Pacific Ocean, just off Awaji Island, it makes this whirlpool on a regular basis. You open a wooden box and there's a cloth wrapper around a lacquer box, which again repeats the name Naruto. You open the lacquer box and there's a cloth wrapper around this broken, humble, summery tea bowl. We don't know when it got broken, but it was repaired with gold lacquer, and at least one piece of it doesn't match the rest of the bowl. I think you get a sense of the whirlpool when you look either down into the bowl or look at it from the base. You get this whirling sense from the inlaid and brush marked slip. So that's just one of many tea bowls. We're pretty sure that this one was purchased from Korea, possibly on order by a Japanese tea master in the 16th century. And we're lucky enough to have it in America today. Well, I'm not going to go into too much more detail about Japanese tea bowls. That's where this whole movement is going. I can talk for hours about different kinds of tea bowls. First thing I would always do when talking about this is quote from Sendo Rikyu, the great tea master of the late 16th century, whose favorites among tea wares, as he puts it, Ichiraku, Nihagi, Sankaratsu. First Raku, then Hagi, then Karatsu. All of them have a Korean connection in that Raku was created as a collaboration between the son or possibly grandson of a Korean potter who came to Japan, and Rikyu. Hagi is as close to Korea as you can get on the Japanese main island. And in the 16th century, of course, the Japanese invaded Korea, and the result of the war, probably the most important result of the war, was that Korean potters were abducted and brought back to Japan. One of the places they were brought to was Hagi. One of the places they were brought to was Karatsu down in Kyushu. So if the pieces of the wares of Hagi and the wares of Karatsu look like Korean punjong ware, it's not really surprising. There are even a few pieces of what we call hibakari, only fire, where the Korean potters actually brought clay as ballast in the ships that brought them to Japan, glazed materials that they carried with them. And of course the potter is Korean, so the only thing in the pot that's Japanese is the fire. Well, in Japan, tea bowls fit into the aesthetics of Japanese tea practice. Aesthetics principles that Rikyu laid out, like Wa, Kei, Sei, and Jaku. Wa is harmony, Kei is respect, Sei is purity, Jaku is simplicity. And those are things that we are reminded as we practice tea to keep in mind all the time. I'm not going to specifically point out how those apply to tea bowls. You can apply them yourselves as you enjoy tea and tea bowl exhibition in the gallery. But there are some other principles that show up more explicitly, I think. Wabi, the sense of reticence, of humility, that a great tea bowl doesn't assert itself too much, but quietly makes its presence known. Sabi, a homonym for rust, the sense that a bowl has been used and loved, maybe broken and repaired, that it's been dirtied by the lips of many drinkers, and sometimes by famous drinkers over the centuries. The bowl should also have a sense of shibui, astringency. It shouldn't again, assert itself like sweetness, but hold itself back like the flavor of a persimmon that's not quite right. And finally, I often talk about the aesthetics of Ma. Literally means open space. It's in a building, if you have 4 columns, Ma is the space between the 4 columns. In a tea bowl, the Ma is the space inside the bowl. More important than the outside of the bowl. And designed to pull you in and make you enjoy the bowl from the inside out. That principle led my pottery teacher to explain to me that electric wheels in particular are spun the opposite direction in Japan than they are in the West. So that your right hand goes inside the bowl to shape the inner space, and the left hand follows it. Apologies to anybody who's left-handed. That's the way it was explained. Of course, there are literally hundreds of different types of tea bowls, hundreds of different potters, sources that we can talk about, from the simple decorative patterns of Ninsei, working in Kyoto in the 17th century. His successor in some ways is Kenzan, more complicated shapes, but very abstractly beautiful, as well as representative of, in this case, plum blossoms, appropriate for our season. There are, well, both Kenzan and Ninsei were working in Kyoto. There are pots from central Japan, from the Mino region, with names attached to them like Oribe, one of the few pottery types that's not a place, but a name of a person, a tea master who succeeded Sendo Rikyu in the 17th century. Seto, one of the oldest potteries in Japan, and they started making tea wares with imitations of Chinese temple, and go on to create a lot of different forms. Next valley over from Seto is Shino, where they develop a glaze that's thick and white and based on feldspar. And when you paint underneath it with iron oxide, the results are these reddish, brownish patterns in white that strike one as a kind of warm snowball. Again, the contrast between what you expect and what you get. It looks warm at the same time that it looks cold. This one is named Hashihime, the bridge maiden. Although there's no maiden in the picture, we only get the bridge. And it's a reference actually to the tale of Genji. There are dozens of other potteries from Japan that I could illustrate, but I think we've had enough. I want to say just a few words about how this comes to the West. That not only does it come directly and form of pots that come from Asia to the West. But potters go to Asia to study and to learn. One who comes back during World War II is Bernard Leach, working in England. He actually inherits the Kenzon family name and produces teawares and other pots. Closer to home, Toshiko Takaezu, from Hawaii originally, but studied in Japan, ended up for more than 20 years being the potter in residence at Princeton University and living in New Hope and creating tea bowls alongside her modernist and postmodernist constructions. Finally, there are independent American potters. I've just brought one as an example. This is Richard Bresnahan's work from Minnesota, who went off to Japan, studied at Karatsu, comes back to the States and develops very much his own style, working with natural materials to make glazes that flow and figure the surfaces of his bowls. And you can experience the culmination of that Western fruiting process downstairs right now. So I'm going to end there. I hope you have questions, and I'm happy to stay and discuss. Try to answer any questions that you have. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions. Yes?
So my question is, I've seen a lot of pottery and ceramics come out of Asia, and it's often very symmetric and finely wrought with no imperfections. But the tea bowls are filled with imperfections and asymmetries, and that seems to be what's valued about them. So can you say a little bit more as to why the tea ceremony and the tea bowls went in that direction as opposed to the other direction?
Okay. It's a complicated question. One thing it has to do with is the difference between Chinese and Japanese aesthetics. That in China, perfection is very much adored, almost worshipped. And the first tea bowls, the first tea equipment that came to Japan all came from China. So it was perfect and round and smooth and didn't have the kind of imperfections we come to associate with Japanese teaware. It was also bloody expensive. We have records of piles of gold being paid for Celadon teaware or for Tenmoku bowls. And eventually the tea masters, who are also Zen practitioners, come to realize that while on the one hand, the development and the preservation of tea and Zen very much depend on wealthy and powerful donors, that the practitioners aren't always going to be wealthy and powerful. And so to break away from the competitive display of Chinese ceramics, they start to pick up on Korean and Japanese ceramics, particularly on Buncheong ware, which is the latest thing coming out of Korea late in the 15th, 16th centuries. And it's, in Korea, it's not made for the imperial class or royal class, but for all kinds of people to use. And so, those tea masters, particularly Murata Shuko and Takenojo, developed this new aesthetic system that not only allows for, but ultimately comes to highly respect the perfection of imperfection. That sense of wabi, of not wanting to put yourself forward like you are a bright mirror, but to put yourself forward as though you are a clouded mirror where it takes time to see everything. It takes experience to understand all that's going on. And it's not all up front, but there's more depth to it. Does that answer your question?
Gives me some food for thought, thank you.
I don't mean to be the final arbiter of why things change, but that's the way I read those tea masters and their history. Other questions? See some hands in the
Yes.
back. Yes.
Reading the book, I understand that tea, it's not about the tea bowl, but it's a tea cell. Tea started with boiled tea, then whipped tea, and then comes to the steamed tea. That's the kind of historical trend. But Song Dynasty, do they already have whipped tea and steamed tea?
In the Tang Dynasty, when Lu Yu writes the Chai, they already have, I think he mentions 5 different kinds of tea. Brick tea, boiled tea, matcha powdered tea, and steeped tea. I don't know what the 5th kind is. I have to look that up. But those are already all practiced, all ways of drinking tea in the 8th century. There's a matter of not existence but fashion. And in the Tang, probably the most common kind of tea was brick tea that would be boiled and it almost comes across like soup by crumbling the brick into hot water and letting it bubble. If anything, that resembles chai in our modern practice more than anything else. So that was popular in the Tang in the 8th, 9th centuries. In Sung, the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, the popular tea was matcha powdered tea. And that's what the Japanese Zen masters picked up on when they went to China. And that's what they brought back to Japan and spread through Japan, first within the Zen temples and then within elite society and then eventually coming down to more ordinary